As the North Koreans have suggested very explicitly in their public statements, that there will be more provocations coming.
The pivot's a lot of sizzle, not a lot of steak.
This is the Spotlight Asia podcast. Matthew Rudolph is a visiting assistant professor in the government department at Georgetown University. He was recently in northern India, where he experienced firsthand the massive protests and public outrage over the brutal gang rape and murder of a 23-year-old woman on a bus in Delhi. Professor Rudolph explains that this tragic event reveals much about the condition of women in northern India.
The regional variation is important to remember, that this happened in North India. In general, the condition of women in North India is much worse than it is in South India. And so there is regional variation within the country, and so people should keep that in mind, both that in South India and in East India, over in the area of Bengal, for example, women's literacy rates and female infanticide, child bride marriages, all that kind of thing are much, much lower than they are in North India and the Hindi belt. So when people say the condition of women in India is a problem, it is generally. I don't disagree with that, but it's important to remember that there's variation, and that in North, Central, and Western India, in what we call the Hindi belt, the area of the country where many people speak Hindi, it is significantly worse than it is elsewhere.
This past December, a young woman and her male friend were returning from seeing a movie in a suburban area when, after boarding a bus, the friend was beaten, thrown off, and the woman gang raped.
An interesting part of this story that is a little bit more than trivial, but I think is also interesting for the way things operate in India, and that a lot of people don't understand. For example, my students in my class, particularly the women students, were, particularly scared by this, idea of getting on a bus and having physical security be at risk, which it is for many women traveling in public transportation on trains and buses all around India. They get groped, they get called at all the time, so much so that there are actually on trains, for example, around Mumbai and other cities, there are women-only cars. But in this particular instance of the rape case, the bus that they got on was not a certified government public transit bus, and there are private transit operations that are, in quotes, public transportation. In other words, anybody gets on them, pays what the conductor at the door asks them to pay for the distance that they're traveling, and it's completely unregulated, privately operated transportation that is public only in the sense that anybody can get on it, and it's not like a cab, right? It's a group of people getting on a bus, and these two people thought that that's what they were getting involved with. They thought they were stepping onto one of these privately operated buses, but in fact what it was a bunch of day laborers who had come from a rural area, who had commandeered a bus for the evening to drive around drunkenly in the bus, and when the driver and the rest of the people on the bus saw what had happened, that a attractive young woman with her male friend were asking to get on the bus, thinking it was one of these privately operated things. They said, "Yeah, come on, get on the bus." That's from that point on, and that was probably fully with some with malice of forethought of deceiving them, and possibly with intent to do exactly what they did do. But I do think that puts in context the micro decisions and so forth that happened here. Not that the woman or the man are in any way responsible, but it does help to understand the chain of events. So just to put that in context.
The young woman died of her injuries in a Singapore hospital 2 weeks later. Her rape and death sparked massive protests throughout India, shutting down Delhi, Jaipur, and Chandigarh, with hundreds of thousands of people taking to the streets. They, of course, were protesting the attack,
but also protesting for the use of the death penalty. And it's important to remember that India is still a death penalty country. They had a moratorium. They had not killed anybody for almost a decade, but recently I believe they just broke that. And the demand was for the use of the death penalty against these the rapists. And in a common law system such as India, there is, the Indian presumption of innocence is not as strong as it is here in the U.S. There is still an element of that, and I found personally disturbing, as somebody who's opposed to the death penalty, these cries for the use of the death penalty, and also no emphasis whatsoever, at least among the public, on the due process.
According to Professor Rudolph, there has been an increase in the social and political awareness of violence against women, domestic abuse, and of women's issues in general in India. This has been spurred by the increase of female journalists and representations in the media. However, Professor Rudolph believes there are contradictory social forces at work that together may fuel a public health and violence against women crisis in India. Bollywood movies and other media now portray women much more sexually than they ever did before. Movies that were once heavily censored now portray intensely sensualized scenarios and images of women. The sexual objectification of women in popular culture, plus other social forces such as massive movements of semi-educated rural male workers into urban centers, heightened levels of alcohol consumption, and the demographic imbalance of males to females due to female infanticide are all contributing factors to violence against women in northern India.
The good news is that since the 1980s, there's been a very active and rising range of social movements trying to support the positive role of women in politics, in society, and in the workplace, to change the structure of gender relations in the society and in the economy. So on the social movement side, there's been a lot, and this has supported a fair amount of public law, none of which has yet been transformative, and the key bits of this legislation have yet to be passed. So one is a women's reservation bill that would introduce quotas or affirmative action quotas for women in the Indian Parliament. And that has been passed by the upper house of the Indian Parliament, but has yet to be passed by the lower house. It has been sitting idle since 2010. And I suspect this range of events may spur change there. Since the events in December, a ordinance was put in place to change the legal requirements for cases with respect to rape and domestic abuse, and new legislation has been written that is pending for a vote in this session, what is called the budget session, this February-March session of the Indian Parliament. So the most immediate likely positive outcome of the rape, in as much as there can be one, is the passage of this legislation that will make domestic abuse definitions legally much more strict and easy to litigate, and change the structure of rape law to make it much easier for women to bring this case, and much less, the previous law was highly biased against women who were bringing these cases at the formal level. At the informal level, the police were generally very reluctant to support and take these accusations, and often tried to actually convince the women to marry their rapists as a solution to the problem. So this legislation hopefully should pass that. The legislation shows the difficulty of making public law in a low-income, still highly rural, and in many ways, traditional society. And the key point of this is what is the legal marriage age, and what would be the equivalent of statutory rape. And I don't think the Indians use that exact terminology, but the equivalent thereof, and to make an analogy to the American context, of consensual sexual relations. And since there is a tradition of marrying women at very young ages in South Asia in general, an argument can be made from a sort of relativist moral reasoning standpoint that the state intervening too aggressively in circumstances where families themselves and possibly even young women, and here I'm saying young women, the debate now is somewhere between, I think, whether to set their age at 16 or 18, themselves may agree to the marriage, and at what point is this an intrusive, overly intrusive element of the state to say a 17-year-old cannot make that decision, or a 17-year-old's family cannot make that decision on their own, or to render them, in violation of the law if they do go ahead and get married. There are some positive elements. The passage of legislation on domestic abuse and rape is the most immediate. The likely activity on the women's reservation bill, and probably a range of other legal activity in the next 12 months, because 12 months by May of 2014 there has to be a general election in India, and so this is likely to put women's issues in a fairly prominent place in the coming election campaign.
For the SFS Asian Studies program at Georgetown University, this has been another installment of the Spotlight Asia podcast. To find more podcasts like this one, visit our website at aspmedia.org.